is our panel on anti-Semitism. I'd like to begin by making a few brief statements. One of the brief travesties of critical race theory is the imposition of a dogmatic racial hierarchy, simplistically lumping people into oppressor or oppressed categories based on racial characteristics alone. Reverse racism, discrimination, a la Ibram X. Kendi, had become the tools of choice to supposedly bring about a quote-unquote more equitable society, but have in reality resurrected racist practices while enabling a warped conception of diversity. There's no greater conception of the consequences of this ideology than the torrent of anti-Semitism we've seen since October 7th. And if the degree of anti-Semitism is an indicator of our societal health, then the high levels we are now experiencing makes it imperative to understand its properties, to examine how anti-Semitism is linked to critical race theory and how it is propagated through our institutions of learning, including K-12 and the collegiate levels, specifically through quote-unquote DEI practices. And to investigate those properties and those circumstances are these three guests, the first being Dr. Brandy Shufutinsky, who's a social worker, writer, researcher, and advocate who now works to develop intercultural and academic opportunities to enhance liberal democratic ideals. We have Dr. Naya Lekht, a research fellow with the Institute for the Studies of Global Anti-Semitism and Policy. In her work studying the Soviet Union, she has developed a comprehensive approach to understanding the dangerous nexus between leftist totalitarian ideologies and anti-Semitism. We are also joined by Soraya Deen, who is the co-founder of the Interfaith Solidarity Network, one of the largest interfaith organizations in LA, as well as the founder of the Muslim Women Speakers Movement, an award-winning Muslim feminist lawyer, interfaith advocate, international activist, and community organizer. I suppose my first question would be, I want to begin by laying the groundwork of what we're going to speak on, anti-Semitism, of course. It's described as the world's oldest hatred, and though many of us are familiar with the traditional tropes, I doubt many of us know about the particulars as to why it persists in the modern era, as well as what shape it takes currently, according to anti-Zionism, within the context of Natan Sharansky's 3 Ds, those being delegitimization, demonization, and double standards. Could you please give us an analysis of anti-Semitism within these parameters?
Okay, thank you. Can you all hear me? Yes? Yes. Okay, wonderful. So, in 3 minutes, right? Anti-Semitism is a very complex form of hatred, and it is the oldest hatred. It is really a shapeshifter, and when I teach about anti-Semitism, I'm going to try very hard to make it succinct, but basically, when we're talking about anti-Semitism, we're talking about 3 distinct eras. The era of anti-Judaism, the era of anti-Semitism, and the era of anti-Zionism. And in each era, the Jew is cast as violating the tenets that are important in that particular era. So, in the era of anti-Judaism, the Jew was juxtaposed to what that society deemed to be moral: Christianity, Christian values. So the Jew was cast as the stubborn individual, the stubborn character. Deicide was born in that time. And so in the era of anti-Judaism, you have a hatred that's religious-based. It's really rooted in hatred of the Jew for his Jewish faith. And the fact of the matter is, how do you fix it? You can convert. So in the era of anti-Judaism, you could still save yourself by conversion, through conversion. As Europe is evolving, and I'm looking at predominantly European anti-Semitism or Western anti-Semitism in the West, as Europe is evolving post-Enlightenment, you go into the era of anti-Semitism, which is racial-based hatred. So now so it's shape-shifting, right? It's changing, it's evolving. Now the 2.0 version of anti-Semitism, known as anti-Semitism, by the way, the term anti-Semitism is coined in the 19th century by Wilhelm Marr. Now the Jew is violating the tenets of the civilization, which are race-based. Because once upon a time, people don't understand this, is that race was a science and it was quote-unquote progressive, right? When I tell my students that, it shocks them. Well, now we're in a 3.0 version of this oldest hatred, and now if you our world is not guided by principles of hierarchy and taxonomy of race, or classifying people based on race. I always ask, what do people care most about today? What are our guiding principles today? Human rights. So, in the era of anti-Zionism, the 3.0 version of this Jew-hating virus, the Jew is now cast as an evil character. What is his guilt? What is his sin? Violation of human rights vis-a-vis Israel, vis-a-vis Zionism. So if we kind of zoom out and look at this picture of this disease which is anti-Semitism, and look at it through these three eras, you see that it's a very, very wily virus. It has the capability of evolving. And it evolves in such a way as to mask itself, and it doesn't look like anti-Semitism because it's dressed in the language that we care so deeply about. So for instance, today we care about social justice and social reform. So the anti-Semitism, which is anti-Zionism, is dressed in that language. That is, it's hard to do it in 3 minutes, but the point is to understand that this old hatred is durable. And the reason it is so durable is it has the ability to mutate. And it mutates through these three eras of anti-Judaism, where Jews are hated for their religion, anti-Semitism, where Jews are hated for their race, and anti-Zionism, where Jews are hated for their ethnicity or national origins.
We're not just limited to 3 minutes, so as we're just starting out, we have much more freedom of movement, so please.
Thank you for that beautiful explanation. I'm going to speak from the perspective of anti-Semitism in the Muslim world. An anti-Semite in the Muslim world chooses to be anti-Semitic. No one in the Muslim world today is unafraid to choose a Jew as his enemy. It is that bad. And it is okay, it is a privilege to be anti-Semitic. If a Jew is not in existence, an anti-Semite will be invented. He needs no provocation. It is that bad. So what we are talking about here takes me back to 2017, when at the Islamic Center of Davis, Imam Shaheen said to a big congregation, which was watched by millions of people, the last hour will not take place until the Muslims fight the Jews. The Al-Aqsa Mosque is besieged and there are no prayers in it. These wicked Jews are prohibiting prayer there. So there is a huge theological basis for anti-Semitism in the Muslim world. There are other intersections, but my whole journey and work is centered around going to that root of the theology that promotes anti-Semitism. And after that incident, of course, I'll be very quick, Rabbi Seth Castleman, who was the president of the Board of Rabbis of Greater Sacramento, he said he accepted the apology, but he asked the Imam to follow it with his words and actions. Castleman at that time was one of the 60 religious and civic leaders who attended that news conference and called on the Imam. But 17 years later, look where we are here. I don't know why it is Sacramento that we need to have this conference, but also know Sacramento is one of the, Sacramento has one of the UC schools ranked in the top 10 most anti-Semitic campuses in America. And how that is distinguished, we know, is that they go into the fact to see whether the highest incidence of anti-Semitic expression, the highest incidence of targeting, and the BDS movement, and the highest incident of most overall anti-Semitism. So, I'm looking at it through that lens, and what you said, all three of those categories fit into the virulent levels of anti-Semitism we see today, and the hostile hatred between the Jewish people and the Muslim people in the United States today. Thank you.
So thank you. That's a brilliant question to start off with. And I'm going to probably echo some of the common themes of my co-panelists. But I'm going to look at anti-Semitism that's coming from the progressive space. And in order to do that, there has to be an understanding of progressive ideology, which puts at the highest tier of achievement being a victim. And for Jewish people, that is something that just isn't part of Jewish culture, is to embrace victimhood. There's the old thing, they tried to kill us, we survived, let's eat. So looking at Jewish folks from that lens, we are the perfect enemy for a people or an ideology or a thought process that actually celebrates victimhood, because Jews refuse to be victims. We talk about surviving, and we've survived atrocities over the millennia, et cetera, we'll survive this one. But the ideology that's attacking Jews is attacking Jews for not embracing victimhood. So much to the point that the Jews that they do embrace are the ones that will say, as a Jew, I'm going to kind of cut ties with the ultimate example of Jewish power, which is emancipation, which is Zionism, which is Israel, which is one of the reasons we see Israel as the main target of contemporary anti-Semitism in this anti-Semitism 3.0. What I do wonder is what the 4.0 is going to be.
May I just comment on that? So actually, when I was one time I was teaching a class and about the three stages of anti-Semitism, and one of my students said, Dr. Lekht, if we could predict what a society will care about in 100 years, we could predict what anti-Semitism will look like. Because recall, anti-Semitism is casting the Jew in opposition to what that society deems. So that's absolutely a very important question.
Soraya, do you have something to add? No. I'd like to move on to our next question. One of the more important topics that I strongly feel is glossed over in the current crisis is the topic of Islamism. Here at home, we have organizations such as the Council of American Islamic Relations, CARE, that encourage student encampments on campus, amongst other organizations. And I believe that a misconception of the current conflict in the Middle East is that it's primarily about land, when I think it has much more to do with the anti-Semitism in the Middle East, especially within fundamentalist Islam, stirred in with Russian propaganda. Islamism's prevalence in the Middle East and its spread in Western democracies is never discussed out of some warped version of respect. But it's an overlooked concern in Western democracies. Any discussion about Islamism is shot down in public under the accusations of quote-unquote Islamophobia, giving fundamentalists a free hand to promote Jew hatred, as well as bring harm to Muslim peoples who are trying to move Islam past fundamentalist practices. So what role does Islamism actually play in the current conflicts, both in the anti-Jew hatred in the Middle East and within Western countries? No, Sister Porter. Take it away.
So, I think there's a religious component, which I'm not an expert on, so I'm not going to speak up on that. But in the Western context, I think there's been an orientalization of Islam and kind of a glorification of Muslims as the ultimate, example of victims. And I think we've seen that since October 7th and in the war against Hamas, where anyone who's labeled as a victim or as the oppressed has free reign to do whatever they need to do to overcome that so-called oppression. And we see it through the sloganeering that's been very prevalent on campuses and city council meetings and everything, to where resistance is justified when. So everything is justified. And I really do think it comes from, at least from the progressive anti-Semitism position, in this glorification of victimhood and of the oppressed, to where, again, the victim, the person labeled oppressed, can do no wrong. And I strongly feel that there are international organizations that feed into that, like UNRWA, like the United Nations, like UNIFIL, now we're seeing in Lebanon, to where their bread and butter is victimhood. It's never moving a people to self-reliance, to agency, to independence. It's creating a class of permanent victimhood, which again we see with the inherited status of refugees. And in that same light, other people aren't given that reign. I'm a Black American woman. I'm a descendant of slaves. Did I inherit slave status now? Like, that is never given to another group of people, another group of refugees, another group of people whose ancestors may have suffered something. But in this case, there's this glorification of a people that keeps them in perpetual victimhood, which then elevates their social status in progressive ideology.
Okay, so this is a great question because I teach the conflict. What is the conflict essentially about? As much as I love America and the West, there's this elitism that we have, which is that we project our values on a part of the world where, in the Middle East, the values are honor, shame, and power. This conflict is about honor and shame in many ways. The shame that a Jew, a dhimmi, who's lived as a dhimmi for hundreds of years in Muslim lands, has become a sovereign. This is unacceptable in the mind of Islamists. I'm not saying all people who practice Islam, but fundamental Islamists. This isn't a conflict about race. This isn't a conflict about oppression. And we do a grave misreading of this conflict by copy-pasting what we here are dealing with in America onto that part of the world. And that part of the world, it's about, and by the way, Jewish people are also tribal. And there's this kind of interesting conversation happening that Israel is the democracy in the Middle East. Israel is a Western kind of country. Well, the Judean people are also very tribal. We're not that different from the Arab people as well. And so in that part of the world, the flex matters. It really does. It's not negotiation at the table. How are wars won? They're not won at the table. They're won because somebody won physically. I mean, I'm sorry. So that's a big misreading of the conflict and thinking that this is about land. This is about the fact that dare a Jew, a dhimmi, become a sovereign in what was once Muslim land.
Thank you. I think there are many layers to this title of Islamists and Islamism. We have a large portion of Muslims who are moderate, who have this vision that one day Islam will reign. They don't mean bad, but they want that level of power to reign. And there are the fundamentalists who are making it happen. We cannot forget. In fact, I moved to DC to do some advocacy work. And in DC, there is no conversation without equating anti-Semitism with Islamophobia. It's a joke. I am a Muslim. I walk into any place. I can raise my voice anywhere. Nobody's afraid of me. So it is a way of silencing dissent. And we have advocated for a long time against the use of this word Islamophobia, because it stifles people like us who want reform in the Muslim world. Islamophobia is a construct. And I ask you, please challenge that. Whenever anybody uses the word, don't say there's Islamophobia. No, there is no Islamophobia in the United States. In fact, we generate it by our behaviors. So Islamophobia is a construct used by Islamists with a vision of a political Islam, which is very detrimental to Muslims ourselves. And if you think we are talking about anti-Semitism, we are talking about it. You are getting towards a solution, but not the Muslims. We are still stuck there where we were and trying to take this high road, and that is very detrimental to my community.
I'd like to start this next question beginning with you, Soraya, but it's definitely extended to the other panelists as well. I first came across the idea of Muslim reform nearly a decade ago, and it was the topic that really introduced me to the quote-unquote woke crisis we find ourselves in today. I've had the privilege of having spoken and gotten to know many Muslim, ex-Muslim, progressive Muslim peoples who insist that it's imperative that such a project succeed given the level of fundamentalist practices still prevalent in the Muslim world, as well as their influence within Western countries. Now, since October 7th within Jewish circles, I've seen a surge of Islamist figures come out to support anti-Zionism with tropes, disingenuous arguments, and they sound much the same as they have speaking against quote-unquote their own people, like the same Muslim progressives, reformists, and even apostates. I've seen that the latter have also been incredibly supportive of Jewish peoples as well as the Jewish state, and there is a remarkable expression of both the diversity of thought and the diversity of peoples who fight to ensure modern liberal values. Now, it celebrates those core nuances of diversity that are often glossed over in our K-12 and collegiate institutions who are more concerned with grievances. So my question here comes in three tiers. The first part I'll introduce now. Is the effort for Muslim reform also vital to the struggle against anti-Semitism?
Reform and anti-Semitism?
Yeah, is it essential to the struggle against anti-Semitism, and what form does it take?
Absolutely. Reform is critical. And in this instance, we are going to look at reform because, you know, Muslims, we have a very broad claim that our faith is perfect. The scripture is perfect. So it's very hard to change anything. And I don't think we need to. What we need to reform is the Muslim mind. You know? Regard our scripture as a historic value, of historical value. And we don't have any leadership that is doing that. And if we can really break into that mold, the victim doesn't have the cure. No? So the Jewish people can't cure this anti-Semitism. We need religious leaders within the United States. That is why it's imperative to go back to that rabbi who was in that press conference with 36 other interfaith leaders to work with him, go back to the community. It's sad, but you have to do that because the hate is so pervasive, and we can really address it through a reformed way of thinking and bringing forth solutions with the Muslim community or the Christian communities who can come together and address this.
Well, go ahead.
So I think that there is definitely an inside work that has to be done within the Muslim community, but I do want to point out that there's outside work also. When you look at who's sitting on your interfaith council or committee, it's unfortunate, but usually non-Muslim groups, the Christians, the Jews, they'll partner with the more radical elements of the Muslim community. And what it does is it silences the reformers, it silences the moderates, it silences the people that actually want to do something to achieve real, not even just peace, but friendship and real dialogue. And that's a huge concern of mine. And we saw that, I mean, at the top level of government here with our White House strategy to combat anti-Semitism. What's the Muslim group they partnered with? CARE. And I do think that that's very important because other voices like yours get silenced or dismissed or ignored, or you're not a real Muslim unless you follow the tenets of the groups that are actually inciting hatred and violence, and that's problematic. So for me, as a Black Jew, I think it's important for our community also to be acknowledged and be aware of who are we partnering with, whose voices are we lifting up, and whose are we ignoring and leaving out of the room.
May I answer that?
Of course.
Yes. So I'm a South Asian Muslim. There are 650 million Muslims in South Asia. How many of you knew that? Yeah, not, oh great, okay, you all do. Because we have been held hostage by the Arab American Muslim. That has to end. And I told you I moved to DC, that was one of the reasons. We want to be the new voice for American Muslims, South Asian Muslims. So please remember us, hold us in your thoughts, support us and promote us. In fact, I'm working on a documentary, visiting many mosques to really document the hatred that is taught. And I love my community. I don't know to be anybody other than a Muslim. I was raised a Muslim. I come from South Asia. We didn't have this hatred towards the Jews there. After October 7th, I took my rabbi friend, she lives about 5 blocks from me, we are interfaith partners, to my mosque. And we were seated and then we were listening to the sermon. And lo and behold, the Imam starts, how Jews cannot be trusted. This is in Los Angeles. And she went back and she wrote one of the most profound letters to the mosque. In fact, both of us, before she wrote it, I confronted the Imam, I confronted the leader. I said, this is not acceptable. You cannot continue to do this from a place of worship. And I was marginalized for writing about it. Look at this Zionist Muslim, paid by the Zionists. Those are the comments and the blame that we get but will still we stand up? Because I am beyond going for consensus. I work on conviction. And we must all begin to do that. So Rabbi Karen, she went back and she wrote this letter. She said to the leader of that mosque, I live 5 blocks from you, but I never felt so unsafe as in your mosque. So I want to highlight that particular relationship I have with that rabbi, and why we Muslims, we have to take responsibility, you know. It's not this person, or that situation, or it's anti-Judaism, anti-Semitism, anti-Zionism. Those are all tags. And it's something that we have forgotten in the Muslim world that we need to love. Thank you.
Which leads into the next tier of my question. A lot of the rhetoric I see during October 7th, it was eerily reminiscent of early on when I became aware of Muslim reform. I hear the same kind of explosive rhetoric now, trying to shield criticism of Islamism when it comes to the situation going on in the Middle East with the war against Israel and of the sort. So I see Muslim reformists and apostate Muslims as being natural allies with Jews and etc. Indeed, I've seen a lot of collaboration happen along those regards, especially with organizations such as the Clarity Coalition. Do you believe these two groups will make natural allies in both reforming Islam and fighting against anti-Semitism?
There's work to do. Yeah, there's no free ice cream, you know. There's work to do, and we are not selling ice cream either. And we have to target so many people. One, I would say, is parents, because I grew up in a country where we had a 30-year civil war. You know, one day I woke up, there was a head of a victim on one of our parapet walls, my neighbors. And we were never taught to hate. My mother would always say, this is politics. So we have to do that work. I think a lot of tilling has to happen. Parents have to get involved. What are the conversations on the dinner table? Are you teaching to hate the Jew, or are you talking about loving one another? That's critical. And then also, if we are going to form that alliance and work forward, I use the word organize, not mobilize. What we are doing here is we are mobilized, right? What we do when we go back is very critical. We need to tell our stories. Public narrative is very important. In fact, I'm doing a lot of work in Nigeria. We're challenged by the Muslim extremism and Christian persecution. What we are doing is, in fact, there's a woman who, I'm going to Nigeria next week. We are building a women-led movement. We want Nigerians to tell their story. Who is behind this? Who is that girl, Deborah Samuel, who was murdered and lynched because she wrote a WhatsApp message? She has a story. Who are her parents? We need to hear that people will be moved. So I feel that even in the United States, we need to tell the Jewish stories. And I don't want to teach the Jewish people, because American Jewry is unique. I can't walk a block without seeing a museum you have built or a community center you have built. I don't need to teach you that. But a new kind of leadership is needed, that which is rooted in grassroots activism, that we have to come together and organize.
Well, current DEI paradigms, especially those coming from the Liberated Ethnic Studies, from where they originate, they almost always look at the approaches and outcomes of group interactions with a myopic focus on race, and almost no attention is given to the idea that the multiplicity of cultures in a single race alone can be responsible for a plethora of general outcomes. For all the talk of championing diversity, it leads to the actual racism it claims to condemn. DEI's message is propagated down to the K-12 levels. So there's this message that Jews are quote-unquote white oppressors and colonizers. And as we've discussed, there's also the mistaken defense of fundamentalist Islam, which propagates the bigotry of low expectations against Muslims. Now, can we extrapolate how these DEI narratives, they actually expand racism by stereotyping Jews, given the diversity in that ethnic background? There's Mizrahi, Sephardic, Ashkenazi, Ethiopians. And can also extrapolate more about how this toxic philosophy harms progressive Muslims by, in the name of diversity, they actually promote blasphemy laws, apostasy, misogyny. Two-tiered questions, so you guys can get away.
I'm going to let Brandy talk about the Liberated Ethnic Studies curriculum, DI. She's really an expert on this. I just want to say how my perspective, how the Jewish community has been pushing against this. One thing I didn't say in my cursory remarks on anti-Semitism is that I believe that anti-Semitism is an alarm system that goes off to signal that something else is wrong, that there is a breakdown, a moral or decay. And so many times it's not really even about the anti-Semitism. So the Liberated Ethnic Studies curriculum, it's not wrong because there's anti-Semitism. It's wrong because of the way that it is casting people according to race. And one of the things that I really don't like within the Jewish community is the following answer. Oh, we're gonna talk about Jews of color. We're gonna bring in a Holocaust unit. We're gonna do training on anti-Semitism to make sure that we fit into that DEI framework. You're not gonna solve anti-Semitism that way because you're not going to the root cause. The root cause is not anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism is a symptom of the problem. And so I really urge anybody here who is a teacher, administrator, advocate, I think it's absolutely so dangerous to continue that paradigm by saying, okay, we're gonna insert a unit on Mizrahi Jews and show how diverse the Jewish community is, and we're really the indigenous people, because you're really contributing to the problem. What is the problem? The demonization of American white people. It's wrong. That's what I believe.
Yes, to all of that. I think that there are a couple of things as far as, I'll be specific to ethnic studies right now, that people get wrong. When you hear ethnic studies, you think that it's the study of different ethnic groups, which sounds great. Sounds like an extension of social studies. Yay. That's not what ethnic studies is. Ethnic studies is a specific discipline. You can't really reform a discipline. Like biology is a discipline, like chemistry is a discipline, ethnic studies is a discipline. And that discipline is rooted in a fundamental idea that there are oppressors who are bad and need to be destroyed by the oppressed, who now it's their turn to kind of get back at their exploiters. That's it. So what got pushed in California and now unfortunately in many other states was pushed because especially after George Floyd was killed, I don't know if anyone paid attention, but there was one word that was used over and over and over and over and over to push not just ethnic studies, but DEI initiatives. Urgency. We have to meet this moment with a sense of urgency. Urgency was used, and it impacted people to really start feeling like, oh my gosh, oh my gosh, oh my gosh, we have to do something. And what that something that was done was DEI initiatives that are based, again, on this rotten framework, different types of programs brought in like ethnic studies. And if the foundation is rotten, rusted, putting lessons on Jews, whether it's so-called Jews of color or Mizrahi Jews, or we need more Holocaust education, you can't build on a rotten foundation. It doesn't work. And for all of the people who had very good intentions, and all of the people who are unaware of the fact that ethnic studies is a specific, rotten, corrupt, anti-Western, anti-democracy, illiberal discipline, there have been a lot of efforts to try to kind of reform it. And it's very similar with DEI. Well, you know what, just include Jews. We need to be included in DEI because we were oppressed. If the purpose of a DEI program is to play the oppression Olympics, from my position of the game, I don't want to play because it's rotten. And so going along with you know what Naya mentioned, once you start jumping on the oppression Olympics bandwagon, we're going to see what we're seeing right now, and you're going to see people pitted against one another. I think that, again, that's one of the foundations, the rotten foundations of far-left progressive ideology, is it depends on an oppressor and it depends on a victim. And right now, today, in this moment, we're seeing Jews as, you know, the bad guys, and we're seeing Muslims as the victims, and we're seeing all of the anti-Semitism and anti-Americanism that's stemming from that.
Yes, I think in the Muslim world, we have to initiate a new level of civic responsibility. I am the co-chair of the Women's Working Group of the International Religious Freedom Roundtable in DC. So every Tuesday, we have about 140 activists from all over the world talking about religious persecution and what's happening, you know. And then there is no gratefulness and value for the United States, and not only in the Muslim world, but even in so many other communities. I think teaching that aspect is very critical to break this mold. gratitude and being proud of this country. We have somehow lost it, and for all the reasons we learned this morning, you know, it's so easy to put America down. They would dare not do it in any other country, particularly in any Muslim majority country. And I stand up. I was at a meeting 2 days ago, they were talking about Christian nationalism and Zionism. I'm like, I'll rather live here, you know, and address issues that we need to address, but this blanket indictment is really advanced in the Muslim world and American Muslims. We have to really stop that, because I'm told, I was also in DC at a research that was presented, 40% of Muslims vote conservative. They have conservative values. But today, if you look at the elections, they're bringing it down to a one-issue election. And masterful propaganda, you know. And if you saw further, 2 days ago, I think there were a group of Muslim Americans who said we are standing with Mr. Trump. I need more specificity on that. But Muslims have our values are based on, have conservative values. And as Kea, Isna, these groups have hijacked us with their one-party agenda. I mean, you might hear, oh, a woman was told not to wear a hijab, so there is a case on that. Or somebody was not allowed to enter a building. These are the petty issues that we have been talking about and really brought so much damage to the American Muslim identity.
Well, at this point, I'd like to open up the audience questions. A brief preamble. I don't mind you giving some brief context to your question, but please keep it short and to the point. Again, no life stories. Thank you. This lady over here.
Hi there. This question is mostly for Naya, but I'm happy to hear other.
We have a microphone coming up. Thank you.
This question is mostly for Naya, but I'm happy to hear also from the rest of the panel. Can you speak a little bit about the emergence of Yiddish as a way to redefine Judaism, to exclude Israel from the identity of being a Jew? I want people to be aware of this. I think this is really important. So that's why I want you to speak about it. Okay, so it's a very, it requires a little bit of context. For those of you who may not know, Yiddish is a language spoken by Jews mainly in Eastern Europe. It is a combination of German, Slavic, but written in Hebrew letters. Most of the Jewish population that was wiped during the Second World War spoke Yiddish. It was their first language. Okay. So I actually did a PhD in Russian literature, and my area was focusing on the Holocaust in the Soviet Union, and I had to learn Yiddish. And that's when I encountered a very interesting phenomenon within Jewish studies, which is the weaponization of the field of Yiddish studies. What's happening in Jewish studies, or has been happening, is that they are saying that Yiddish is the indigenous language, the language of the victim Jew, and Hebrew is the language of the colonizer Jew. And so, I know it's very warped and very nuanced, but my former colleagues in academia, who are Slavicists as well and Yiddishists, would tweet things such as, you know, Yiddish is the language of the real Jew and Hebrew is the language of the white Jew, of the colonizer Jew. And so again, you could see that it's just a repackaging of Marxism within the feud between co-opting of languages. Again, one language is the language of the oppressed, that's Yiddish, and one language is the language of the oppressor, Hebrew. And it's quite common within Jewish studies. Another thing that I'd like to say, which kind of it's tangential to your question, is that Jewish studies, it's very painful for me to say this because I am both Jewish, I was in Jewish studies, and I was in academia, but who's at the forefront of anti-Zionism on our campuses? It's Jewish studies professors. And I'm really sorry to say that. It's really hard for me to say, but I feel comfortable enough saying it here. So that what's happened with the conversation around Yiddish and Hebrew is that it's basically another conversation about oppressor and oppressed, just recast between Hebrew and Yiddish. Is that what you wanted me to address? Yeah.
I want to bring in just a parallel quickly on this. And I'm going to do that here because we're in the United States of America, and I'm going to bring my identities to the panel. So it's very similar to this celebration, and Jake, I think you talked about it before, for Black Americans and this idea of AAVE, African American Vernacular English, to where the good Black person will speak in slang, but the bad oppressor Black person is the one who speaks regular standard English. It's very similar. And what that idea does is it creates a dependent class, a victim class who's lesser than, a little bit ashamed, needs that kind of paternalistic bigotry that comes from the far left. There are very close parallels to that. Related to Yiddish and Hebrew, there also is that desire to really cut the ties of Jewish peoplehood from the land that Jewish people came out of, which is Israel.
Next question. This gentleman over here.
Thank you. I think, Soraya, you touched on this in terms of the propaganda that's used that underlies a lot of these ideologies, at least DI, ethnic studies, et cetera, anti-Semitism. But their propaganda is very effective because it's consistent, it's like bumper sticker language, and it uses certain phrases over and over again. So my question is that how do you counter that propaganda with an equally simple message that resonates with people? Because it seems like we all agree, we have a lot of free thinkers here, and it's a very nuanced, complex conversation, but how do you boil that down in a language that can be understood and reach people and resonate with people in the same way that that propaganda has done?
I don't know, have anybody read Baptist Battles? Somebody told me read that. It's a 20-30 year movement that first how they got churches, then they went into school boards, then they went into law faculties where law students were, and that's how they built that brand of Christianity, I was told. But this didn't happen overnight. So there will be baby steps, not baby steps really, we can't anymore stroll to the goal. We have to sprint. I believe as a community organizer, we might not work for Middle East peace, but we can work for peace in our neighborhood, in our community. So we had to keep it small. Like for instance, what I always tell whomever I train in community organizing is, it's not the issue. The first question you need to ask is, who are my people? When the people come, the issue will get resolved. So right now we are leading with the issue. We're not having the people. So if you look at the Birmingham bus boycott, there were people. They didn't have resources. They had one thing. They had their feet. They marched for 1 year. Do we have that level of commitment? I'm highly skeptical. But we have to find those people. I always tell, don't be just interested in the issue, be outraged. That will give you the fuel to do this work.
I'll take it a slightly different pathway, but I'll just say that we suck at slogans. The left is a lot better at it. But I want to share a moment I had with a student in a classroom on the Middle East, and they asked me, why do I believe that from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free is a call for the erasure of Israel. Really lovely slogan, right? From the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. Brilliant. And one student said to me, I think that the problem with the conflict is that it's a perpetual, we are just misunderstanding each other and we're suspecting the worst of each other. They challenged me and they said, why do you suspect that from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free means the erasure of Israel? So I realized in that moment is that our students don't understand how to decipher propaganda. So I said to them, do you know what the Nazis called the final extermination? It was what they talked about when they talked about exterminating the Jews. It was a euphemism. It was called the final solution. And the Wannsee Conference in 1941, when they talked about what they were going to do, they used the language of final solution, and they told the journalists that they were to report and use specifically that language, final solution, final solution. So I said to the student, if I was living in Germany in 1939 or 40 and somebody said to me, the final solution, I mean, how do I know that that's really what they want to do? But, you know, totalitarian regimes, they're brilliant crafters of propaganda, and they understand language. And so from the river to the sea, the operative word here is Palestine, right? It's not that from the river to the sea there will be a free Israel. It's not a criticism of Israel, it's a replacement of Israel with Palestine. And so that's you know, but you see, to your point, a brilliant propaganda slogan. We suck at it, okay? The best I've come with is what my cousin has actually told me, we're here, deal with it. It's a sticker I created. It's the best one that I know of, like, we're here, Jews, deal with it. I'm not gonna explain anymore. But our students, our youth don't know how to decipher euphemisms that are often deployed by bad faith actors. But I share your sentiment.
We have time for one more question. Ma'am?
I'd like to follow up on something that both Brandy and Soraya touched on. So you mentioned, Brandy, and it's very inspiring to think that we should find other partners to work with other than, say, CARE, because then obviously we can have a broader representation of a partner that's not pushing us into the extreme. And I'm also cognizant of something that Soraya said, which is that we have, unfortunately, a majority of mosques who are preaching anti-Israel, anti-Zionist. So my question is, how do those two work in concert? So how would you suggest we justify working with other partners when in fact they may not represent the majority of what's being taught? And so how do you do that?
Very good point. I think that that's exactly why you find other partners. It's not about them representing the people, it's about representing the idea. And when we're talking about coalition building, we're trying to break out of the idea of just, we want representation based on color or based on the outward appearance. We want representation based on ideas, coming to common ground on a specific goal. And it's not about majority. If it is, then that means that I'm gonna have to, as a Jewish person, give in to the idea that I'll be a Deenie and that's okay because they're the majority. That's not how you fight back. That's not just. That's not how you fight for justice. It's working with folks where you can come together because you share the same ideas or the same goals. And unfortunately, in this moment, that seems to be in a minority. There's a lot of radicalization going on in mosques, especially in the Western world. I mean, it's funny, not funny, that we'll probably see more radicalization in the West and less coming out of at least the Middle East, because there's a crackdown in the Middle East because there's authoritarian government, so they can do that, on radicalization in mosques. But I think that we're looking at it from a different lens. My goal isn't to talk to the most people. My goal is to talk and work with the people and the folks that we're working towards a common goal.
One thing we Muslim reformers lack is political supportability. Yeah, we need that. We need that so desperately. And in fact, we are a coalition of women. I run a Muslim Women Speakers Bureau with 21 speakers, 21 women. None of you must have heard of us speaking. But we have toured, we've gone to MIT, from MIT to Harvard, to smaller universities. We are doing our work. And for me, one of the larger goals and the most narrowest goal would be to move for a congressional hearing where we call for some kind of law where mosques don't preach hate. No religious institution should preach hate. It's a small ask, but we need to be heard. Muslim women have called for this, and we want to push the envelope, we want to push the agenda, and just, we all need each other. None of us can get there by ourselves. So support our work. I would again say, reach out to us, give us a platform, give us a platform. We are building platforms, we're creating, but we need more to be heard and seen. Thank you.
Well, we're out of time, so I'd like to take a moment to thank our guests for their insightful and important commentary. Thank you.